By the middle of the 1700s, France and Britain each controlled large areas of North America, which bordered on each other for thousands of miles. Each country feared the other and sought to increase the area it controlled. These ambitions collided on the frontier and eventually led to war. Native Americans lived on most of the territory claimed by France and Britain. There were few French settlers, though. Therefore, they did not threaten to seize Native American lands. However, the need of British settlers for farmland led to conflict with the Native Americans. By the 1740s, British settlers were pushing into the Ohio River Valley lands claimed by the French. The pressure soon led to trouble. George Washington was the leader of the Virginia militia. Washington traveled west with orders to build a fort. However, when he arrived in the region, the French were already building their own fort, Fort Duquesne. At first, the British suffered many defeats. However, the situation improved for Britain during 1757, when William Pitt became Prime Minister. With Pitt's generals in command, the war entered a new phase. In the summer of 1758, Britain scored its first major victory in the war at Louisburg, and in the fall, British took Fort Duquesne. The defeat of the French left the British in control of a vast area in North America. However, whatever sense of triumph British leaders felt at the war's outcome was soon replaced by a nagging realization the victory had substituted one set of problems for another. So, the 6 events of British dominance for the colonies was Pontiac's War, the Boston Massacre, and the 4 tax acts that they inflicted on the colonies. The very first act that they put on the colonies was the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act was the first British effort to impose new taxes, and it put a duty on several products. The act also called for harsh punishment of smugglers. The next act was the Quartering Act, and the purpose of the Quartering Act was to save money. The act required colonists to quarter British troops and provide them with food and other supplies. Then there was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that all colonists buy special tax stamps for all kinds of products and activities. The Stamp Acts had to be placed on newspapers, wills, licenses, insurance policies, land titles, contracts, and other documents. The very last act that they put on the colonists was the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Act set up a system to enforce the new import duties. To help customs officers find illegal goods, they were allowed to use writs of assistance. These were court orders that allowed officials to make searches without saying for what they were searching. For all of these acts, the colonists protested harshly against them. For example, for the Stamp Act, protests against the Stamp Act were widespread. A man named Patrick Henry made an emotional speech attacking the law. Merchants in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia organized a boycott of British goods. Delegates from 9 colonies sent a petition to Parliament to end Stamp and Sugar Acts. For the Townshend Acts, many colonists saw these writs and the searches they allowed as yet another violation of their rights. The colonists reacted by boycotting British goods. All of these protests worked. The boycott on British goods hurt British merchants and manufacturers who put the pressure on Parliament. So, in 1770, on March 5th, the Parliament repealed all the Townshend duties, except for the one on tea. Now, this angered the colonists, and Parliament had not acted on time. So, in Boston, an angry crowd of workers surrounded a small group of soldiers, and they shouted and they threw snowballs and rocks, and the frightened soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 and wounding 6. So, Governor Thomas Hutchinson tried to calm things down by having the 9 soldiers involved in the shooting arrested and tried for murder. John Adams was a well-known Massachusetts lawyer, and he decided to defend the soldiers. In the end, only 2 soldiers were convicted. their punishment was having their thumbs branded. Pontiac's war and the French and Indian War were the main reason that Britain was in such deep debt. So, by default, they were also the main reason that all these tax acts were put on the colonists. Now, Pontiac's war was in the last days of the French and Indian War, and it was because of the leader of the Ottawa Nation, Pontiac, had formed an alliance with Western natives. So, they went to attack Western British forces, and they destroyed British forts, and 2,000 backcountry settlers were killed. British settlers reacted with equal viciousness, and they killed many Native Americans, even those who hadn't attacked them. The British finally had defeated Pontiac's forces in early August at a battle near Fort Pitt. Pontiac continued to fight for another year, but by the fall of 1764, the war was over. So, that war was the main reason that Britain was in such deep debt for having their soldiers overseas in order to help the colonists. When colonists heard that the Townshend Acts had been repealed, they were overjoyed. But the dispute over taxes was not settled. Before long, colonists would face other crises that would lead to armed resistance. So still protest would be a problem in their future. Okay, so one of the last things I'll be talking about today is the Boston Tea Party. So during the early 1770s, the protests in the colonies against British policies quieted down. However, that did not mean the colonists were satisfied with the British government. Although most of the Townshend duties had been repealed, the one on tea remained. Many colonists drank tea. With every cup they drank, they were paying a tax that Parliament had placed on them without their consent. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, and this act was intended to help the British East India Company, one of the most important companies in Britain. So, for many years, the company had made money growing tea in India and selling it in Britain and in the colonies. The Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea by allowing the East India Company to ship tea directly to the colonies. However, some colonists still reacted angrily to the part of the act that gave the East India Company a monopoly on selling British tea in the colonies. And a monopoly is a total control of a market for a certain product. The monopoly hurt colonial merchants. Many of them sold Dutch tea that was smuggled into the colonies. Now they would not be able to compete with the lower-priced East India Company tea. This led to the Boston Tea Party. So a group of colonists called the Sons of Liberty soon organized in port cities to stop the East India Company tea from being unloaded. They threatened ship captains who were bringing in the tea and colonial tea merchants who said they would buy it. No tea was unloaded in New York, Philadelphia, or other ports. Governor Thomas Hutchinson decided to make sure that the tea would be unloaded. He refused to give the arriving tea ships papers that would allow them to return to England. So when the first tea ships from Britain arrived, Hutchinson ordered the cargo to be unloaded. For more than 2 weeks, feelings were tense in Boston. Finally, on the night of December 16th, 1773, a large crowd gathered in the harbor. Suddenly, a large group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded the tea ship. During the next 3 hours, they threw 342 cases of tea into the harbor. As the crowd cheered and shouted, the raiders destroyed 90,000 pounds of tea. Thank you for joining me today and learning about all the events that led up to the shot heard around the world.